Before the first word was ever spoken, the earth was already a symphony. The air carried the sounds of rushing rivers, the calls of birds echoing through vast valleys, and the deep, resonant growl of predators stalking the night. The forests whispered with wind, the seas roared endlessly, and thunder split the skies with its elemental voice. Yet, within this orchestra of the natural world, there was no human speech, no structured utterance that bound meaning to sound. For countless millennia, the planet was filled with voices, but none that belonged to us. To imagine a world before words is to enter a silence of a special kind, not the absence of sound, but the absence of shared meaning. Our ancestors lived in this silence, not mute, but voiceless in a way we can hardly comprehend. They could cry out, laugh, groan, or howl, but these sounds belonged to instinct, not to language. They were the reflexes of survival, a mother's call to her child, a hunter's alarm at sudden danger, a guttural exclamation of pain or triumph. Communication existed, but it was raw, fleeting, and uncertain. There were no stories yet, no memory carried across generations in words. There was no past to speak of and no future to imagine. There was only the immediate present and the sounds that survival demanded. Picture a small band of early hominins moving across the savannah, 2 million years ago. Their eyes scan the horizon for predators, their ears tuned to the faint rustle of grass that might betray a stalking lion. When one spots danger, he shouts, a sharp cry that sends the group into motion. They understand, but only because of the urgency in the tone, not because of an agreed-upon word. The cry is meaningful in that moment, yet it leaves nothing behind. By dusk, it is gone. By tomorrow, it is forgotten. This was the rhythm of life before language, sounds tied to moments, but not yet to memory. And yet, within this primitive silence, something was stirring. Our ancestors were not only creatures of instinct, they were thinkers, toolmakers, fire builders. They gazed at the stars above and felt the pull of mystery. They mourned their dead and carried grief in their hearts. These inner worlds demanded expression far richer than cries and growls could provide. The silence of meaning was too heavy to last forever. Somewhere in this gap between instinct and thought, the first seeds of language began to take root. It is tempting to think of the first language as a sudden invention, a miraculous moment when one person spoke the first true word, and from there, language was born. But the truth is far slower, more mysterious. Language did not arrive with a spark, but with a long smolder. It grew across hundreds of thousands of years, as scattered sounds became patterns, and patterns became symbols. At first, perhaps, a sound was tied to water, another to fire, another to danger. Perhaps a rhythm of grunts expressed hunger or an intonation conveyed belonging. Over generations, these sounds gained weight, and the silence began to break. But the world before words was not an empty place. It was rich in other languages, the language of the body, of gesture, of expression. A hand raised in warning, a gaze lingering too long, a touch that carried comfort. These were the grammar of a voiceless people. Their silence was filled with meaning, yet meaning that could not escape the boundaries of the moment. A gesture vanished as soon as it was seen. A cry disappeared as soon as it was heard. Language, in contrast, would one day give permanence to memory. It would trap the present, carry it forward, and allow the past to live within the minds of the future. But in this early silence, permanence did not yet exist. Imagine a mother rocking her child beside the fire. She hums, not a word, not even a melody, but a sound meant to soothe. In her voice, we hear the earliest hint of something more than instinct, intention. She is not only reacting, she is creating. She is shaping sound for a purpose, and her child feels its meaning, even if no word is attached. This is the bridge between silence and speech, a bridge built not from vocabulary, but from emotion. In many ways, the world before words was a world of immense intimacy. To communicate without language is to rely on closeness, on shared presence. You cannot tell a story to someone far away, nor pass down a memory to someone you will never meet. Meaning depended on being there, face to face, heart to heart. It was fragile, but it was real. Yet, this fragility also meant that nothing lasted. Without words, memory slipped away like water through open hands. Entire lives, entire generations, lived and died without leaving behind more than bones and tools. Their voices are forever silent to us. And this silence haunts us. It is why the first language is forgotten, why no one remembers. Sound leaves no fossil, no artifact. We can uncover the stone tools of our ancestors, the bones of their bodies, the ashes of their fires. But we will never hear their cries, never recover their proto-words. The world before words is a world lost to us, not because it never existed, but because it could not be preserved. The silence we speak of is not theirs, it is ours, the silence of ignorance. Yet, in this absence lies wonder, for though we cannot recover their voices, we can still imagine them. Every word we speak today, every name, every poem, every whisper, is a descendant of that ancient silence. The first language may be gone, but its echoes live in us. Our speech is their legacy, their invisible monument. Before words, the world was silent. With words, the world remembers. But the paradox remains. The very tool created to preserve memory cannot preserve its own origin. This is the mystery that begins our journey, a world before words, a silence pregnant with sound, a silence that waits to be broken. And once broken, it would change humanity forever. The silence of the pre-linguistic world was not absolute. Even before words existed, sound had already begun to shape the destiny of our species. Imagine the cries of a newborn echoing across a Pleistocene plain. That piercing wail, helpless, yet demanding, was more than noise. It was a signal powerful enough to summon a mother's instinct, to stir a group into motion, to ensure survival. It was perhaps the most ancient reminder that sound could bind life together. For millions of years, early hominins relied on a limited palette of vocalizations, sharp calls of alarm, guttural growls of aggression, soft coos of comfort. These sounds were immediate and emotional, arising from the body's deepest instincts rather than the mind's deliberate choices. When a predator approached, a scream conveyed urgency. When a hunt succeeded, a cheer erupted, uniting the group in shared triumph. The range was small, but it was meaningful. Survival did not demand poetry, only clarity. And clarity in those early days was often achieved not through structure, but through raw emotion. Yet, slowly, sparks of something greater began to appear. Across countless generations, these instinctive sounds began to stretch, to bend, to adapt. A growl could mean anger in one context, but warning in another. A sharp cry could point to a predator in the grass, or perhaps to danger lurking in the trees. What began as reflex began to acquire shades of intention. And within these subtle shifts lay the first sparks of language, the transformation of sound into symbol. Anthropologists believe that, as our ancestors' brains grew in size, so too did their ability to connect sound with meaning. The shaping of sound was no longer just about reacting, it was about influencing. To cry out was not only to feel fear but to instill fear in others. To coo was not only to comfort but to nurture. Early humans learned that their voices could shape the emotions and actions of those around them. Sound became more than expression, it became persuasion. This was the earliest foundation of what we now call communication. Consider a small hunting party creeping through tall grass as the sun sets. One member spots the faint outline of prey. In silence, he cannot alert the others without startling the animal. But in sound, a low grunt, a rhythmic pulse, he conveys urgency without alarm. The others shift, ready themselves, and the hunt continues. This exchange is primitive, but it is coordinated. It is not yet language, but it is something close, intention wrapped in sound. The hunt succeeds, and with it, the group learns again the power of the voice. The sparks of sound also shaped the rhythm of daily life. Mothers sang wordless lullabies, repeating tones to soothe restless children. Gatherers hummed as they worked, their voices blending with the rustle of leaves and the drone of insects. Groups may have created patterns of chant, using rhythm to synchronize effort during collective tasks, dragging heavy wood, pounding grain, or chasing game. These early sounds were not yet language, but they carried the essence of it, structure, repetition, and shared meaning. In these moments, the first embers of culture glowed, and alongside practical needs came something even more mysterious: emotion. Sound gave form to feelings that could not otherwise be seen. A laugh shared around a fire deepened bonds within a group. A mournful wail carried grief beyond the body of a single mourner, inviting the entire community into sorrow. In sound, emotion leapt from one soul to another, binding individuals into something larger, into a collective. This binding force was fragile, yet profound. It was the first hint that sound could create society, not just survival. What is striking about these early sparks is how they blurred the boundary between instinct and invention. Other animals, too, relied on calls and cries. Wolves howled, birds sang, primates shrieked. But humans were beginning to push further, to twist sound into something new. Where a monkey's alarm call meant eagle or snake, humans began layering sound with flexibility. One sound could take on many shades of meaning. Over time, this flexibility gave birth to creativity. Creativity, in turn, gave birth to the possibility of words. And yet, in this slow emergence, there was no clear beginning. No single cry can be marked as the first word. No first hunter, no first mother, no first child held within their throat the moment of linguistic genesis. Instead, it was a gradual dawn, imperceptible to those living it but monumental in its legacy. The sparks of sound were like scattered stars on a dark horizon, each flicker insignificant alone, but together, heralding the coming of light. Some scientists believe that this stage may have lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Generation after generation lived within a liminal space, beyond silence, but not yet within language. To them, sound was a tool for the present, never for the past or future. No one could tell a story. No one could ask a question. No one could imagine a world beyond the immediate here and now. This limitation may seem small, but it was profound. Without language, thought itself was bound, tethered to the present moment. The sparks of sound were flickering, but the fire had not yet caught. And so humanity stood on a threshold. In one world, the world of cries and calls, survival was possible. But in another, the world yet to come, survival would be transformed by memory, story, and imagination. The sparks of sound were the doorway to this new world. They carried the promise of words, though no one knew it then. To the people of that age, sound was simply life itself, the cry of danger, the song of comfort, the rhythm of labor. But in hindsight, we see what they could not. These were the first sparks of a revolution that would one day make humans storytellers, dreamers, poets, and philosophers. A revolution that would allow us not just to survive the present, but to shape the future. Yet every revolution begins quietly, and this one began with sparks, faint, fragile, easily forgotten. We may never know their exact form, but we can imagine them, the echoes of voices long gone, carried on the wind of time. This is the paradox of the first sparks of sound. They were too small to endure, too fragile to be remembered. Yet without them, no word would ever have been born. They were the beginning, and yet they left no trace. Their legacy is not in memory, but in us, in the fact that we speak at all. Every word today, every whisper, every poem, carries within it the faint echo of those ancient sparks. They may be forgotten, but they are never gone. Before the world was filled with words, it was filled with gestures. Long before a throat could shape a syllable, hands, eyes, and bodies carried meaning. To understand the dawn of language, we must first understand the silent language of movement, the ancient grammar of gesture. Imagine a band of early humans moving together through dense forest. A single raised hand halts the group. A finger points toward rustling leaves. Shoulders tense, eyes widen, bodies lean forward or back. No words are spoken, but every gesture is understood. In these moments, survival depended less on sound than on sight. The body was the voice, and the language of the body was both immediate and universal. Anthropologists argue that this gestural system may have been humanity's earliest form of structured communication. While other primates also use gestures, a chimpanzee reaching out for food or a bonobo extending an arm in peace, humans pushed this form to new complexity. A glance, a hand signal, a shift in posture became ways to convey meaning that sound alone could not yet hold. Gestures created patterns, and patterns created memory. Even without words, the body spoke. The advantages of gesture were clear. Unlike sound, which could be swallowed by wind or drowned by water, a gesture was silent, stealthy, and precise. During a hunt, when silence meant survival, a hand signal could direct movement without alerting prey. In conflict, a raised weapon or a forward lean could warn without bloodshed. Around the fire, gestures may have given shape to the first stories, fingers tracing shapes of animals, hands mimicking the chase, arms outstretched to mimic the leap of prey. The body was the first canvas of imagination. But gestures carried limits. They demanded presence. To understand a gesture, one had to be near enough to see it, awake enough to notice, familiar enough to interpret. A gesture could not travel across distance, could not echo in the dark, could not linger once the hand fell still. And as human groups expanded, as they roamed wider landscapes and formed larger bands, the reliance on gesture alone became fragile. The body could not carry all that the mind longed to say. Still, gesture was not abandoned when sound began to rise. Instead, the two fused. Many linguists believe that human language was born not from sound alone, but from the marriage of gesture and voice. A grunt paired with a pointing finger meant far more than either alone. A facial expression shaded a cry with anger, sorrow, or joy. This partnership gave communication richness, layers of meaning, echoes of intention, shadows of nuance. Even today, our words remain incomplete without our hands. We gesture when we speak, as if echoing an ancient truth, that the body was the first storyteller. Consider the child of a prehistoric mother tugging at her hand to show hunger, or pointing toward the river for water. Long before vocabulary, children relied on gestures to bridge their needs to the world. This mirrors what we see even now. Modern infants gesture before they speak, waving, pointing, reaching. Our own development recapitulates our species' history, a reminder etched into the rhythm of our growth. Gesture is our first language, and perhaps it was humanity's first language too. But gestures did more than convey need. They expressed belonging. A hand on a shoulder reassured, an embrace consoled, a circle of clasped hands around a fire united. In these physical bonds, society was born. To gesture was not only to communicate, it was to connect. These silent languages carved the first outlines of community, a shared fabric woven from glances, motions, and touch. And yet, the silence of gesture was fragile. When night fell and darkness swallowed vision, gestures failed. When distance grew, gestures vanished. It was here, in the shadows of limitation, that the sparks of sound found their place. Sound could cross darkness, travel distance, reach beyond sight. Where gesture stopped, voice could continue. The two became partners, hand and throat working together. Slowly, across centuries, the balance tipped. Sound grew bolder, more flexible, more permanent. Gesture became its companion rather than its master. But without gesture, there would have been no bridge to voice. Even now, echoes of this ancient partnership remain. We speak, but our hands move. We point, we nod, we raise our brows. In a crowded street, where words are lost, we wave. Across a noisy hall, we signal. In silence, we sign. The body remembers what the voice once could not provide. Gesture has never left us. It lingers as a shadow, a fossil of the first attempts at meaning. So when we ask why no one remembers the first language, part of the answer lies here, because perhaps the first language was not spoken at all. Perhaps it was drawn in air by the hand, sculpted in space by the body. Perhaps the first tongue was not a sound, but a motion, fleeting, vanishing, impossible to preserve. No stone can record a gesture. No fossil can hold the arc of a hand. The language of gesture lives only in the present moment. It is communication without memory, expression without permanence. And yet, it was vital. For without gesture, sound would have been chaos. Gesture gave shape to intention, carved pathways for meaning, and prepared the ground for voice. It was the scaffold upon which speech was built, the silent architecture of future words. When the first sparks of sound rose, it was gesture that gave them context, meaning, and power. In this sense, gesture was not replaced by voice. It was absorbed into it. And so, the story of the first language is not simply a story of sound. It is a story of hands and eyes, of posture and presence, of a world where the body spoke before the mouth. To remember the first language, we must remember the silent grammar of the body, the language that has never been forgotten, even if it can never be recorded. Night falls, and with it, the world changes. Darkness gathers over the ancient plains, swallowing the shapes of trees and beasts, wrapping the land in shadows. For early humans, the night was not only a time of danger, but also a time of gathering. Around a crackling fire, the band would draw close, their faces lit in flickering amber light, their shadows cast long against the earth. And here, in this fragile circle of warmth, something remarkable unfolded. The fire was more than survival. It was a theater, a sanctuary, a canvas for imagination. Within its glow, voices rose differently than they did in the chaos of the hunt or the panic of alarm. Here, in the stillness of night, sounds could stretch, linger, and transform. The cries of the day softened into rhythm. The sharpness of warning melted into tone. In the quiet between sparks, the human voice found new purpose, not only to signal danger or command action, but to weave connection. Perhaps it was here, at the fireside, that the first true proto-words were born. Not words as we know them, fixed and structured, but sounds shaped with intention, beyond the immediate present. A hunter might mimic the call of an animal, not to warn of danger, but to retell the day's chase. A gatherer might hum the rhythm of work, sharing it with others through repetition. A child, restless in the glow of flame, might be soothed, not only by touch but by a patterned sound, a lullaby older than memory. Around the fire, sound became memory, and memory became culture. The firelight was humanity's first stage for storytelling. Imagine hands rising into the air, casting shadows on rock, mimicking the antlers of a deer or the wings of a bird. The body, already rich in gesture, found a new partner in the voice. Together, gesture and sound gave birth to something profound, narrative. No longer tied only to the present, humans could now share the past, replay the hunt, recount the storm, relive the danger. The fire gave space for sound to stretch beyond instinct, into memory, into imagination, into story. And with story came meaning. The world was vast, filled with mysteries, storms that split the skies, rivers that swelled and vanished, stars that burned endlessly above. Around the fire, humans began to shape explanations for these mysteries, not through silence, but through sound. Proto-words, chants, and calls may have merged into the first rituals. A death in the group was not only grief, but ceremony. A successful hunt was not only survival, but celebration. Around the fire, language became more than a tool. It became sacred. This sacredness is why some anthropologists believe that the first true language did not emerge in the hunt or the field, but in ritual. The fire's glow gave rise to rhythm, repetition, and chant. Words, or proto-words, spoken in ritual carried power, even if their meaning was not fixed. To utter a sound in unison was to bind a group together, to affirm that they were one. A chant was not about clarity, but about unity. In this way, language was not simply invented, it was consecrated. Consider the moment when a child asked, not through words, but through a sound, a gesture, why? Why does thunder roar? Why does the sun fall? Why do we die? These questions demanded more than instinctive cries could provide. They demanded stories. And stories demanded the shaping of sound into patterns that could last beyond a moment. Even if no true language yet existed, the seeds of myth were already planted in the soil of firelight. But this proto-language, this tongue of firelight, could never survive. It belonged to the flicker of a night, the breath of a voice, the closeness of a circle. It could not be recorded, could not be carried forward, except through living memory. With each generation, the sounds shifted, changed, disappeared. The fire carried countless languages in its glow, but none of them endured. They were the first forgotten tongues, swallowed by the passing of time. The tragedy is that these early voices may have been the most human of all. They carried not only survival, but wonder. They asked questions, offered comfort, gave shape to fear, and transformed chaos into meaning. And yet, no record of them remains. We can imagine the flicker of hands against stone, the murmur of voices, the rise and fall of chant, but we will never know the words themselves. They are gone, forgotten, not because they lacked importance, but because they lacked permanence. Still, the fire left a legacy. It trained the human voice to stretch, to shape, to linger. It taught groups that sound could bind them, not only in the urgency of the hunt, but in the intimacy of the night. It seeded the idea that words, when they finally came, could hold more than commands. They could hold memory, myth, and meaning. The forgotten tongue of firelight may be lost, but its echoes live in every story we tell today. For every tale begins as theirs did, with a voice in the dark and a circle gathered close to listen. Even now, when we gather by a fire, or sit in the glow of a screen, or huddle together to share stories, we are reenacting this ancient ritual. We may not know their sounds, but we repeat their act. We keep alive the rhythm they discovered in flame and night. Every myth we inherit, every lullaby we hum, every tale we whisper, owes its ancestry to that circle of light. And so, when we ask why no one remembers the first language, part of the answer is this: because the first languages were meant to be forgotten. They were not designed to endure, but to bind, to heal, to explain, to share. They lived as long as the fire burned, and when the embers died, so too did their words. But in their vanishing, they left something greater, the pattern, the possibility, the promise of language itself. The fire taught us to speak, but it also taught us to forget. It gave us story, but it also erased the stories it carried. It was both the birthplace of language and the graveyard of its earliest forms. And within this paradox lies the mystery of our origins. To remember the forgotten tongue of firelight is impossible. But to imagine it, to feel its echo in our own voices, is to glimpse the threshold where humanity stepped out of silence and into speech. Language did not emerge all at once as a complete system. It grew little by little, in the shadows of survival and the glow of firelight. But one of its most profound transformations came when sound stopped being only about the present moment and became a vessel for memory. When humans first learned to use language to hold on to the past, something extraordinary happened. Meaning became memory, and memory became power. Before this shift, the world of our ancestors was fragile in time. Gestures vanished as soon as they were seen. Cries faded as soon as they were heard. Nothing endured beyond the moment. A band of humans could coordinate a hunt, warn of danger, or soothe a child, but the knowledge died as quickly as it was used. Without words to capture memory, every generation had to learn anew, every mistake repeated, every lesson rediscovered. But gradually, language began to change this. The first proto-words were not only sounds tied to immediate needs, they became carriers of lessons. A warning cry that once meant only, "Predator here," may have begun to expand into, "Predator comes at dusk," or, "Predator waits near the river." In that shift, the present moment stretched into the past and future. Memory was being shared, not just experienced. Picture an elder by the fire, surrounded by the younger members of the group. In gestures and proto-words, in chants and rhythms, the elder recalls a great hunt from long ago. "Be wary of the tall grass," his voice suggests. "There the lion waits." Even if the words are not yet structured, the meaning is clear. Through sound, the past is carried forward, and knowledge no longer dies with the day. This was the birth of oral tradition, fragile, shifting, but powerful enough to change the course of humanity. With memory came continuity. Generations could begin to build upon one another, passing forward not only tools and skills but stories, warnings, rituals, and wisdom. A child growing up in such a group inherited not only the landscape of their world but the remembered experiences of those who came before. For the first time, memory was no longer confined to the individual brain. It became collective, held in the voices of the group. In this way, language became humanity's first external memory system, long before writing, long before marks on stone. This transformation also gave rise to identity. Memory carried in language allowed groups to define themselves, to say not only, "We survive," but, "We remember." They could tell the story of their ancestors, their migrations, their battles, their triumphs. Even if these stories were fragmented and mythic, they offered belonging. They gave shape to a collective self. Without memory, there is only the fleeting now. With memory, there is history, and with history, there is meaning. But here lies the paradox. While language allowed humans to preserve memory, it could not preserve itself. The first languages were not written down. They shifted and changed with every telling, reshaped by the tongues of new speakers, eroded by the winds of time. Memory was preserved, but the vessel of memory, the original words, was lost. What we inherit today are not their sounds, but only their shadows, distorted by distance and change. The first language remembered the world, but the world cannot remember the first language. Consider how fragile this system was. A story told around a fire depended on memory, repetition, and performance. If one generation failed to repeat it, the story vanished forever. If one sound shifted in meaning, the memory itself was altered. Unlike written words, oral languages had no permanence, no fixed anchor. They lived only as long as they were spoken. Each time a story was told, it was reborn, sometimes faithfully, sometimes transformed. In this sense, the earliest languages were both vessels of memory and instruments of forgetting. They preserved the past, but never in its original form. And yet, this fragility was also their strength. Because stories could shift, they could adapt. Myths could absorb new experiences, rituals could evolve with changing environments, and memory could be reshaped to guide survival in different times and places. Memory was never fixed but alive, a living thread woven by each generation. This adaptability was one of the reasons language flourished. Unlike bone or stone, it was not bound to form. Unlike gesture, it was not bound to presence. Language moved, grew, changed, and in doing so, it carried humanity forward. To imagine these first moments when meaning became memory is to imagine the dawn of culture. A story told about the stars could guide navigation. A chant repeated in ritual could ease grief. A warning passed to a child could prevent death. These were not just words. They were survival encoded in sound, identity written in breath. They were the first archives, fragile but enduring enough to change us forever. But with this new power came a haunting truth. While language gave us the ability to remember, it also guaranteed that the earliest language itself would be forgotten. Every word we speak today is descended from those first utterances, but none of them are the same. Their voices are lost, their shapes dissolved, their sounds erased by time. The first language succeeded in preserving memory, but not its own. It carried the past forward, but it could not carry itself. And this is the central paradox of our journey. We owe everything to the first language, yet we cannot remember it. Its words are gone, but its legacy remains. In every story, in every conversation, in every thought we shape in sound. Meaning became memory, and in that moment, humanity stepped into history. But the first language that carried us there was left behind, erased by the very force it unleashed, time. Language is not only a creation of the mind, it is carved into the body. To understand why no one remembers the first language, we must first understand the instruments that allowed it to exist at all. Our voices are not accidents of nature, but the result of a slow evolutionary symphony. Each note, every breath, every vibration, every movement of the tongue and lips, is a legacy written into our anatomy. Without these changes, the first language could never have been spoken. Consider the voice box, the larynx. In most primates, it sits high in the throat, limiting the range of sounds they can make. For millions of years, this arrangement worked well. A high larynx protects the airway, preventing food from choking the animal. But somewhere along the human lineage, the larynx descended. This simple anatomical shift opened a vast acoustic chamber, allowing humans to produce a far richer palette of sounds. Vowels emerged, clear and distinct, able to be combined in endless patterns. Yet the price was steep. With a lowered larynx, humans became vulnerable to choking, a risk no other primate faces so severely. We gambled with survival for the gift of speech, and that gamble paid off in ways no one could have imagined. Alongside the larynx, the tongue became a sculptor of sound. Unlike in other primates, the human tongue is flexible and highly maneuverable, capable of creating a vast range of articulations. This flexibility transformed the vocal tract into a living instrument, one capable of infinite variation. From guttural consonants to delicate sibilants, from deep-throated hums to whispering hisses, the human mouth became a canvas upon which the first language was painted. But anatomy alone is not enough. Sound without meaning is only noise. The brain had to evolve to control, interpret, and assign significance to these sounds. Here, two regions emerged as the architects of speech, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. These specialized regions of the brain gave humans the ability to not only produce complex vocalizations but to comprehend them. A cry could now be more than alarm, it could be intention, question, or instruction. A pattern of sounds could become a word, and words could combine into sentences. The leap from noise to language was both biological and cognitive, rooted in flesh and fired in neurons. Still, the origins were not sudden. For countless generations, early humans likely straddled the line between animal call and true speech. Their vocalizations were more flexible than those of chimpanzees, but less precise than our own. Perhaps their words were broad and overlapping, each sound carrying multiple shades of meaning. Perhaps rhythm and melody carried more weight than precise articulation. Imagine a proto-language where tone and cadence mattered as much as the syllables themselves, a song-like communication that blurred the line between speech and music. In this sense, the first language may not have sounded like the clipped precision of modern speech, but like something closer to chant, song, or incantation. This possibility opens another perspective, that language and music may share a common ancestor. Both rely on rhythm, pitch, and pattern. Both stir emotion as much as thought. Around ancient campfires, our ancestors may have spoken and sung in equal measure, their communication woven from melody as much as meaning. The sound of evolution, then, was not just utilitarian, it was aesthetic. Language carried beauty long before it carried grammar. The body's transformation also extended to breath. To speak is to master air, to control the flow of breath with precision. Other animals can vocalize, but humans alone can sustain the steady exhalations required for extended speech. This control is not trivial. It allowed for sentences, for long expressions of thought, for the weaving of ideas into narrative. With breath came the possibility of storytelling, the shaping of sound into memory, myth, and meaning. Yet every advantage came with a cost. The lowered larynx exposed humans to choking. The reliance on speech created vulnerabilities, silence in injury, miscommunication in noise. The expansion of brain regions for language demanded energy, forcing humans into a cycle of higher caloric needs. Our species paid for language with risk and hunger, but the benefits outweighed the dangers. With speech, humans could coordinate, imagine, plan, and most importantly, transmit knowledge across time. Still, it is worth reflecting on the irony. The very features that made the first language possible are the same that ensured it would vanish. Human anatomy allowed for a vast range of sounds, but also guaranteed endless variation. No two groups would shape words in exactly the same way. Over generations, sounds drifted, shifted, fragmented. The first language, born of biology, was also doomed by biology, by the restless shifting tongue, by the improvisation of breath, by the malleability of the voice. The human body did not preserve language, it reinvented it constantly. Consider also the role of childhood. Human infants are born helpless, with brains still developing outside the womb. This vulnerability is costly, but it also creates a long window for learning. A child spends years immersed in sound before mastering speech, absorbing the rhythms and patterns of language as though it were music. This extended learning period allowed the first languages to take hold, to be passed on, to adapt and grow. But it also meant that language was never fixed. Each child remade it anew, shaping sound slightly differently, altering the inheritance of words. In this sense, every generation became both the guardian and the betrayer of the first language. The sound of evolution, then, is both triumph and loss. We gained the ability to speak, but we lost the permanence of our earliest tongue. Every word we speak today is a descendant of that ancient voice, yet none of them are the same. The larynx, the tongue, the brain, they gave us the power of language, but they also gave us the inevitability of change. As we listen to our own voices, to the sounds of language around us, we are hearing echoes of this evolutionary journey. The clarity of vowels, the precision of consonants, the flow of breath, each is a monument to the body's transformation. But the first language itself, its sound has vanished into time. It lived for a moment, sung by the bodies that made it possible, and then it dissolved, replaced by countless new voices. The instruments remain. The song has changed. And so, the first language was not only forgotten, it was unremembered by design, by the shifting, evolving, ever-restless sound of the human body itself. Night falls, and with it comes silence, except for the fire. Flames crackle and hiss, their rhythm steady, their glow casting long shadows against the cave walls. It is here, in this fragile circle of warmth and safety, that something extraordinary unfolded. For millions of years, the dark belonged to predators. But with fire, humans created a sanctuary, a place where the night could be pushed back, where fear could be turned into gathering and gathering into story. Around these flames, the first languages deepened into something more than signals. They became the music of memory, the chorus of belonging. The firelight chorus was more than conversation. It was the heartbeat of early human culture. Imagine a small band of hunter-gatherers huddled close, their faces lit in amber and gold. They speak in murmurs, in laughter, in fragments of words. Some sounds are gestures, others are chants, some are imitations of the world beyond the fire, the call of a bird, the growl of a lion, the rush of water in a nearby stream. The boundaries between language, song, and mimicry blur. This is not just communication, it is performance, ritual, art. Anthropologists suggest that fire extended the day, creating hours of leisure when humans were not hunting, foraging, or protecting themselves. In those extra hours, imagination had room to expand. Words, once practical, became playful. Myths could take shape, fables could be shared, and wisdom could be passed down in ways that transcended mere survival. Around the fire, the first poets spoke, and the first storytellers stitched the fabric of human identity. But why here, in the firelight? Because fire itself was a kind of teacher. It taught rhythm, the crackling of wood and the pulsing glow invited imitation. It taught awe, its flickering dance was hypnotic, like the cadence of words. And it taught community, for no one sat at a fire alone for long. Fire was a magnet, a center, a unifier. In its glow, language was drawn outward, projected into collective experience. It is possible that ritualized speech, what we might call proto-storytelling, began here. Perhaps an elder, with more memory than strength, recited hunting patterns for the young. Perhaps mothers soothed children with repetitive, melodic words. Perhaps chants arose during rituals, blending rhythm with meaning until the two were inseparable. This was the seedbed of culture, where language expanded from necessity into identity. The firelight chorus also transformed memory itself. In the wild, sounds vanish quickly, they serve their purpose and fade. But in the circle of fire, words could be repeated, echoed, reinforced. A chant could be spoken in unison, a story retold, night after night. Through this repetition, language gained durability. The first language may be forgotten today, but it was here, in the fire's embrace, that it learned to resist the silence of forgetting. There is another layer, the social glue. Around fire, humans did not just speak, they bonded. The act of listening together, of watching the same flames, of sharing the same story, created unity. This was more than survival, it was belonging. A word learned in this context was not just a tool, it was a thread in a web of meaning, binding the group together. Without the firelight chorus, language might have remained utilitarian, a way to shout warnings or signal hunts. With it, language became sacred, and sacred it was. Evidence from early caves suggests that storytelling was accompanied by gesture, painting, even music. A drum-like rhythm might be struck on hollow wood, or a bone flute played softly. Imagine the fusion, the dance of shadows, the steady beat, the rising voice of a storyteller. In such moments, the line between communication and ceremony disappears. To speak is to chant is to bind the group, and to bind the group is to survive. Language became more than survival, it became meaning. Still, one must wonder, what did these firelit stories sound like? They were not like ours. They lacked complex grammar, perhaps even fixed words. They may have leaned heavily on repetition, on shared knowledge, on gestures that completed the spoken fragments. But in that imperfection lay their beauty. The firelight chorus was not about precision. It was about resonance. It was about feeling words vibrate in the chest, about watching meaning ripple across familiar faces. The first languages did not strive for clarity alone, they strove for connection. There is something haunting in this thought, that language first flourished in darkness, surrounded by the unknown, with the fire as its fragile anchor. Beyond the circle, predators prowled, storms rumbled, shadows shifted. But inside, the voice became stronger than the night. Words, fragile as they were, offered safety, not just through information, but through togetherness. The firelight chorus was humanity's first cathedral, its first classroom, its first theater. And when the fire dimmed, when the embers sank into ash, the words lingered. They followed people into sleep, into dreams, into memory. They were carried across valleys and mountains, woven into migrations, seeded into new lands. The firelight chorus gave language a body, not of flesh, but of tradition. Words became something that could outlive a single voice, carried by many, shaped by all. Yet, like all things born of breath and memory, they were fragile. Each chorus was slightly different, each telling reshaped, each chant altered. Slowly, over generations, the first language dissolved into many. Around countless fires, countless variations were born. And just as the flames consume wood and turn it to ash, the first language was consumed by its own abundance, leaving behind only echoes in the tongues of today. The firelight chorus reminds us that language is not only a system of grammar. It is a living ritual. It is sound against silence, light against darkness, presence against isolation. And though the first language is gone, the chorus itself remains. Every story told today, every gathering where words flow in rhythm and warmth, is a continuation of that primal circle. We no longer sit in caves, but the firelight lives on, in our voices, in our stories, in the unbroken chain of human speech. Language without structure is like scattered stars, bright, beautiful, but disconnected. At some point in our deep prehistory, humans began to trace the constellations. They learned to draw lines between words, to anchor meaning with patterns, to create not just sound, but order. This was the birth of grammar, one of the most transformative leaps in human history, though no one remembers when, or where, or how it began. Before grammar, communication was likely fluid and flexible. Words or sounds carried meaning, but meaning shifted with context. A gesture might complete a sentence, a tone might carry urgency, a shared memory might supply the missing pieces. This system worked, but it was fragile. Its power depended on the immediate moment, on the shared presence of speaker and listener. But as groups grew larger, as tasks became more complex, as memory needed reinforcement across generations, structure emerged. Grammar was not an invention, it was an evolution. Imagine a group of early humans planning a hunt. You spear deer without structure might simply be three separate sounds. But when arranged with rules, subject, action, object, it became something more, a clear command, a transferable idea. Suddenly, the same words could be rearranged: deer spear you deer spear. Only one arrangement meant what was intended. Grammar crystallized meaning, separating the possible from the ambiguous. It allowed humans not just to speak, but to think with precision. Grammar gave birth to time. With it, people could distinguish "I hunt" from "I hunted" or "I will hunt." This small leap opened vast horizons. The past could be recalled, the future imagined, the present described in relation to both. Time entered language, and with it, storytelling deepened. A hunt was no longer just a description, it became a memory. A plan was no longer just gesture and intention, it became a promise. Grammar turned fleeting moments into narrative threads, binding them into continuity. It also opened the door to abstraction. Without structure, language clings to the concrete, things seen, touched, heard. With grammar, the invisible could be named. One could speak of what was not here, of spirits, of ancestors, of gods. One could link cause and effect, If we hunt, we eat. If we do not, we starve. In this way, grammar became the first philosopher's tool, the scaffold on which imagination climbed higher than mere survival. Some anthropologists suggest grammar evolved slowly through countless micro-adjustments in speech. A repeated hunting chant might begin with simple words, "We hunt deer." Over time, variations emerged. "We hunt many deer, we hunted deer yesterday, we will hunt deer tomorrow." Each small addition created rules, and rules reinforced memory. Children hearing these patterns absorbed them intuitively, and in passing them on, they cemented them further. Grammar grew not from conscious design, but from repetition, rhythm, and necessity. Others argue that grammar reflects the architecture of the human brain. Neural patterns, designed to detect order in chaos, may have shaped the way language organized itself. Just as the brain finds rhythm in music, it finds structure in speech. To speak grammatically was not just convenient, it was natural. It was the path of least resistance for a mind that hungered for clarity. Still, the mystery remains. Why no one remembers the first grammar? Perhaps because it was not a single event, but a gradual dawn. Unlike the sharp glow of firelight, grammar emerged like twilight, too slow to notice until the sky was already transformed. There was never one first sentence, perfectly formed, ringing through a valley of listeners. There were countless proto-sentences, fragments polished over generations until they became rules. By the time anyone might have recognized the leap was already complete. The birth of grammar also reshaped society itself. With rules, teaching became possible. Elders could pass down not just stories but lessons, agricultural methods, navigation routes, medicinal knowledge. Grammar was a vessel strong enough to carry information across time. Oral traditions became chains of memory, each link reinforced by structure. Without grammar, knowledge was fragile, easily lost. With it, knowledge could endure. And yet, grammar was not uniform. Different groups, scattered across continents, shaped different rules. One group might place the verb first, another, the subject. Some languages leaned on word endings, others on word order. Even in its birth, grammar was plural. This divergence is why no one remembers the first grammar, because there was no single grammar. There were many, sprouting like branches from the same root, bending and twisting in unique directions. The implications were profound. Grammar allowed not only communication, but identity. To speak a certain way was to belong to a certain group. To master the rules was to be part of the circle. Outsiders who spoke differently became strangers, sometimes even threats. Grammar, then, was not only a tool of connection, but a boundary of separation. It bound tribes together while marking the lines between them. In this sense, grammar carries both beauty and danger. It is the architecture of human unity and the seed of human division. It allows us to share ideas across centuries, but it also creates the differences we cling to so fiercely. The first grammar, wherever it was spoken, has dissolved into thousands of forms. Each one carries echoes of the same leap, but each one insists on its own identity. There is something profoundly human in this forgetting. We remember stories, not rules. We cherish voices, not syntax. The people who spoke the first structured sentences probably did not marvel at them. They simply used them, unaware of the revolution they were igniting. Their children absorbed the patterns without question, their grandchildren polished them. And within a few generations, the leap was invisible. Grammar, the very thing that gave memory strength, was itself forgotten. And yet, we live in its legacy. Every sentence we speak today, every poem, every law, every prayer rests on the unseen foundation of that prehistoric leap. Without grammar, there would be no history, no science, no philosophy. There would be no we, no I, no you. There would be only sounds scattered like stars in a dark sky. But because of grammar, there are constellations. There are stories. There is us. For hundreds of thousands of years, language lived only in breath. It was smoke rising into the air, ephemeral and vanishing as quickly as it was spoken. A word could guide a hunt, soothe a child, ignite a quarrel, but when the sound faded, it was gone. Nothing remained but memory. And memory, fragile as it is, bends with time. But then, slowly, something remarkable happened. Humans began to search for permanence. They longed to anchor the spoken word, to tether thought to something that would endure. The earliest solution was not writing as we know it, but symbols, carved into stone, painted on cave walls, etched into bone and wood. These marks were not yet full sentences, but they carried meaning, a bridge between speech and silence. Imagine a Paleolithic hunter crouching at the mouth of a cave, a sharp stone in his hand. He drags it across the wall, leaving behind a pattern of lines, not random but intentional. To him, it might represent the antlers of a deer, the tracks of an animal, or perhaps a memory of the hunt itself. To others, it is a reminder, here food can be found, here we triumphed. These scratches are more than art. They are language, fossilized. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, and Chauvet's breathtaking panels of animals, horses, lions, mammoths, are often viewed as art galleries of prehistory. But perhaps they were something deeper: records, stories, warnings. Rituals spoken and then fixed in pigment. Each image is a sentence without words, grammar expressed in shape and color. Though we cannot read them as their makers did, we feel their power. They are the first libraries, carved into stone and sealed in darkness. At first, these symbols were tied tightly to the physical world. A handprint meant, "I was here." A spiral could signal a path or a cycle. A cluster of dots might represent the number of animals seen or days past. Over time, abstraction crept in. The marks no longer only depicted what was seen, but what was imagined. Stars traced in patterns, spirits hinted at in hybrid creatures. This shift was monumental. It meant humans were not only recording life but encoding thought. From these humble beginnings emerged proto-writing systems. The tallies cut into bones and antler fragments, such as the famous Ishango bone of Central Africa, suggest early attempts at counting, keeping track of quantities beyond the power of memory alone. A series of notches was more than decoration, it was language, stripped down to essentials, enduring across seasons. With each tally, a sentence without sound was preserved. The leap from oral grammar to carved symbol was not immediate, nor was it universal. Many cultures relied on oral traditions alone, carrying their entire history in memory, in song, in ritual. But where the need for permanence was strongest, in trade, in ritual, in the cycles of the stars, symbols flourished. They were humanity's insurance against forgetting. And yet, even in these early markings, mystery reigns. Were they meant for others to read or only for the self? Did they serve practical purposes or spiritual ones? Was the carved deer on a cave wall a hunting manual, a prayer, or a piece of self-expression? We cannot know. What we do know is this: no one remembers the first true sentence carved in stone. The moment when symbols stopped being mere pictures and became a system of communication has been swallowed by time. Think of what was lost. Somewhere, in some forgotten valley, perhaps a community invented a full symbolic language, complete with grammar and rules, centuries before Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs. Perhaps they carved their stories into wooden planks or scratched them into clay that never survived. Entire civilizations may have spoken not only with breath but with symbols, and we would never know, because their words dissolved back into earth. The silence of prehistory hides countless lost languages. And yet, the surviving fragments are enough to remind us humans could not bear the thought of silence erasing them. To carve a mark was to resist oblivion. It was a defiance against time. Each line, each handprint, each dot was a whisper to the future: remember me, remember us. The permanence of stone changed language itself. Spoken words became fleeting, but carved words demanded reflection. To inscribe something was to choose carefully. One could not ramble on stone. The process distilled thought, sharpened meaning, turned noise into message. In this way, early symbols were both practical and sacred. They were not chatter, they were monuments. Over millennia, these carvings multiplied. Symbols evolved into protoscripts, protoscripts into alphabets, alphabets into literature. But it all began with the simplest impulse: to make language endure beyond breath. Every modern book, every digital message, every poem whispered into eternity owes its existence to those first scratches on cave walls. And still, like the first grammar, no one remembers the first carving that truly counted as writing. It lies somewhere between art and code, between ritual and record. We are left with silence, where there once were voices, pictures, where there once were words. The cave paintings, the tally marks, the spirals, they speak, but they do not explain. Their meaning is locked, their grammar lost. Yet perhaps this is the true gift of these stone-bound words: they remind us that forgetting is as old as remembering. The first languages, spoken or carved, were not preserved for us. They were lived. They belonged to their makers, and then they faded, as all things do. What survives are echoes, handprints on stone, shadows of speech. And in those echoes, we hear the yearning of our ancestors to be remembered, to leave behind more than bones, to write themselves into time. Their words have vanished, but their impulse lives on. Every time we write, carve, record, or share, we repeat their act. We too carve our words into stone, though now the stone is digital, glowing, impermanent in its own way. The birth of carved language was not the end of forgetting, but it was the beginning of the fight against it. And though we do not remember the first words carved in stone, we live in their shadow. Every story we tell, every history we write, is part of the same struggle. Language is humanity's most precious inheritance, yet it is also the most fragile. Bones fossilize, tools endure, cave art lingers beneath layers of stone, but spoken words dissolve with the air that carries them. A people may rise, thrive, and vanish, and with them goes their tongue, their laughter, their lullabies, their prayers. What remains are silent traces, shards of pottery, forgotten cities, unmarked graves. Their voices vanish as if they never existed. Consider this: of the thousands of languages spoken throughout human history, the vast majority are gone. They were never written, never recorded, never preserved. Entire systems of thought, entire ways of perceiving the world, disappeared with the last speaker who carried them. When she died, an entire universe went with her. We may never even know those universes existed. The statistics of today hint at the enormity of this loss. Linguists estimate that, of the 7,000 languages spoken across the globe, nearly half may disappear by the end of this century. Every 2 weeks, another language dies, silenced not by lack of beauty or complexity, but by the relentless pressure of dominant tongues. English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, these giant rivers of speech swallow the smaller streams. The result is homogenization, the loss of diversity. Yet this process has been happening for tens of thousands of years. Long before global empires or modern technology, tongues rose and fell. Imagine the first clans who spoke the earliest structured language. Their grammar was alive with subtle tones, rhythms, and rules no outsider could grasp. That language was their lifeline, weaving together knowledge of the hunt, the seasons, the plants that heal, and the plants that kill. Then, as centuries passed, perhaps a neighboring group grew stronger, their tongue spreading through trade or conquest. Slowly, the first language withered. Within a few generations, only the elders remembered its words. Eventually, even they were gone. A silence fell, and with it, a forgetting so complete that no trace remained. This is the fate of most languages: disappearance without witness. We have no word list, no translation, no grammar book to mark their existence. They dissolve as breath dissolves in the wind. Even when fragments survive, the full body of language, its humor, its poetry, its worldview, cannot be reconstructed. For a language is more than words. It is a mirror of the mind, a lens through which reality is seen. Think of the Yagan language of Tierra del Fuego. For centuries, it thrived at the southern tip of the world, rich with words describing the sea, the winds, the motions of paddles against water. Yet by the 21st century, it dwindled to a single fluent speaker, Cristina Calderon. With her passing in 2022, the Yagan voice fell silent forever. Though some words have been recorded, the soul of the language, its rhythm, its living warmth, is gone. What remains are echoes without breath. This tragedy is not modern alone. The same story must have played out tens of thousands of times in prehistory. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers on the edge of the Ice Age world. They speak a tongue that carries stories of the animals, the spirits, the paths of rivers. One harsh winter, their numbers dwindle. A neighboring clan takes them in, but their children adopt the dominant language of their hosts. The old tongue fades, unspoken, unremembered. Its last words may have been whispered by a mother to her child, words of comfort that no one else could understand. Then, silence. A silence that stretches across millennia. And yet, this silence is not total. When we study myths, symbols, and even genetic evidence, faint shadows of those vanished languages flicker at the edges of our perception. A rhythm in an epic poem, a recurring sound in place names, a shared root between distant dialects, these are fossils of speech. They remind us that nothing truly vanishes without leaving a trace, even if the trace is indecipherable. Still, the question remains: why does no one remember the first language? The answer lies in forgetting's cruel symmetry. Memory is collective. It requires community. A language survives only if it is spoken, if it is sung, if it is shared between generations. Once the chain of transmission is broken, no amount of memory can restore it. When the last fluent speaker dies, a library burns to the ground, a library written only in sound and forever irretrievable. Philosophically, this is devastating. Each vanished language carried not just knowledge, but perspective. Some languages describe directions by the cardinal points: north, south, east, west, so their speakers always knew where they stood in the world. Others have dozens of words for snow, rain, or wind, born from deep intimacy with their environment. To lose such a language is to lose a unique way of being human. It is to lose a fragment of the great mosaic of thought. But there is also beauty in this loss. It reminds us of language's true nature. It is alive. It is not a fossil, not a rigid system. It breathes, evolves, and like all living things, it dies. Perhaps the first language vanished not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. Its echoes seeded other tongues, its grammar splintered into countless dialects, its sounds reshaped into new expressions. In its death, it gave birth to diversity. Even so, we cannot escape the melancholy truth. The first language, like so many that followed, vanished without remembrance. No one carved it in stone, no one recorded its sounds, no one preserved its poetry. It disappeared into silence, taking with it a universe of meaning. And yet, we still search. In the patterns of surviving languages, in the whispers of myth, in the shadows of words, we chase the voices that vanished. For though no one remembers the first language, the human longing to remember is eternal. That longing itself is a kind of memory, a refusal to let silence have the final word. If the first language was ever truly spoken, it did not last long. Language, by its very nature, fragments. Like rivers splitting into countless streams, the speech of a single group inevitably divides into many. Families branch into clans, clans drift into tribes, tribes wander across landscapes, each carrying with them their own variations of sound, rhythm, and grammar. Over generations, differences accumulate. A vowel shifts, a consonant fades, a phrase takes on new meaning. Before long, what was once shared has become distinct. Diversity, not unity, is the natural destiny of speech. This branching is as inevitable as the spread of humanity itself. When early groups of Homo sapiens left Africa tens of thousands of years ago, they carried their words with them. Those words were not fixed in stone, they were alive, adapting to new environments, new experiences, new needs. The hunters of the tundra coined terms for snow, ice, and caribou. The gatherers of the rainforest shaped words for vines, fruits, and shadows beneath towering canopies. The desert dwellers found language for sand, for thirst, for the stars that guided their nights. Each landscape sculpted the tongue that described it. Within just a few thousand years, the descendants of a single group could no longer understand one another. What began as dialects grew into fully separate languages. This process continues even today. Consider how Latin, once spoken across the Roman Empire, fractured into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Or how Old English, brought to the British Isles, transformed over centuries into a form barely recognizable to its speakers today. If such shifts can happen in historical time, how much more dramatic must they have been in the deep expanse of prehistory? The birth of many tongues was not simply a matter of sound. It was a birth of identity. Each language became a banner of belonging, a marker of who was us and who was them. Shared words created kinship, trust, and unity. Different words marked the stranger, the outsider, the other. This duality, unity within, separation without, gave language its double-edged power. It bound communities together, but it also divided humanity into countless cultural islands. Archaeological evidence hints at this early diversity. Even in the Paleolithic, art, tools, and rituals show regional styles. The engravings of southern Africa differ from the cave paintings of Europe. Burial customs in Siberia are not the same as those in the Near East. These material differences reflect not just geography, but thought, and thought is carried by language. The cultural mosaics of prehistory must have been mirrored by linguistic mosaics, each group speaking in ways that only they understood. Yet, this diversity was not chaos. Just as species evolved through variation, so too did languages. They branched, merged, borrowed, and adapted, creating a great linguistic tree with countless twigs and leaves. Today, linguists attempt to reconstruct this tree, tracing languages back to common ancestors. The Indo-European family, for example, links English to Hindi, Greek to Russian, all stemming from a tongue spoken perhaps 6,000 years ago. And beyond that, the trail grows faint, but some suggest even deeper families, Nostratic, Eurasiatic, or Proto-World. These are bold attempts to peer into the fog of prehistory, to imagine the first branching points where many tongues were born. The psychological effect of this diversification was profound. With every new tongue came a new worldview. Some languages encode relationships differently, emphasizing family bonds or social hierarchy. Others frame time uniquely, some flowing from past to future, others circling endlessly. In one tongue, colors might be divided into dozens of shades, in another, only light and dark exist. These variations show that language does not simply label reality, it shapes it. And with each branching, humanity multiplied the ways in which reality could be perceived. But there is a paradox here. If diversity is natural, why do we yearn to find the first language? Perhaps it is because multiplicity overwhelms us. To imagine thousands of tongues is to confront fragmentation, difference, and distance. We long for origins, for a singular moment when we all spoke as one. That yearning itself is a sign of the loss we feel, a desire for unity in a world of divergence. In truth, the first language did not vanish into silence, it transformed into many. Its essence survives, scattered across dialects and vocabularies, carried in the genetic code of grammar itself. Every tongue today, no matter how different, bears faint echoes of that ancient voice. In this sense, the first language was never lost, it was multiplied. Consider the image of a great fire. At first, there is one flame, burning bright. Then sparks leap outward, igniting other fires, each burning in its own place, in its own way. The original flame may die, but its essence lives on in the countless others it created. So it was with the birth of many tongues. This realization transforms our melancholy into awe. We may never know the words of the first language, but we can see its descendants all around us. The thousands of languages spoken today, from the cliques of the San people in Africa to the tonal symphonies of East Asia, from the fast-flowing rhythms of Italian to the intricate consonant clusters of Georgian, are living memorials to that moment of birth. Each tongue is a shard of a shattered whole, a fragment of a forgotten unity. Together, they remind us of our shared origin, even as they highlight our endless diversity. The birth of many tongues was not a mistake, nor a tragedy. It was humanity's greatest creative act. In fracturing, we multiplied possibilities. In diverging, we expanded thought. In speaking differently, we discovered new ways of being. The first language is gone, but its children sing across the world, a chorus of difference that is, itself, a kind of remembrance. Before language left its mark in spoken sound, it left its shadow in symbols. Long before alphabets, before inscriptions carved into clay or etched into bone, humanity recorded itself in images. On the walls of caves, across boulders exposed to wind and rain, on fragments of ivory and antler, marks were left behind, spirals, dots, lines, hands pressed against stone. They were not speech, yet they were communication. They were echoes of voices we cannot hear, the silent witnesses to a time when words were still unbound. The earliest known cave art, some dating back nearly 70,000 years, whispers of this silent language. In the dark recesses of European caves, flickering torches illuminated painted mammoths, bison, lions, and horses. Some of these animals no longer roam the earth, but their presence on stone testifies to a shared act of remembering. To paint was to speak without words, to preserve without voice. These images were not idle decoration. They carried meaning, perhaps ritualistic, perhaps instructional, perhaps spiritual. Whatever their purpose, they were expressions of thought externalized, a form of communication that could outlast the moment of breath. Scholars have long debated whether these paintings were tied to language or existed before it. Could the artists who painted the great bulls of Lascaux or the hand stencils of Sulawesi already have spoken richly structured tongues? Or were these images the scaffolding upon which language itself was built, a bridge from gesture to speech, from silence to utterance? The truth is lost, but the debate itself reveals how closely art and language have always intertwined. What is certain is that art allowed communication to transcend presence. A spoken word dies the moment it is uttered. An image lingers. A handprint on stone outlives its maker by millennia. This permanence transformed communication. It gave humanity the power to speak across time, not just across space. A hunter could draw an animal for others to see days later. A shaman could mark a symbol whose meaning would remain long after his own voice had faded. Through art, memory was given a vessel more enduring than flesh. Consider the hand stencils, negative imprints where ancient people placed their palms against rock and blue pigment around them. To look upon them today is to see not a drawing, but a presence, a gesture frozen in time. Each handprint is a declaration, I was here. Yet it also raises a question. Was it merely a mark of being, or did it carry a message? Perhaps each hand was a sign of belonging, of membership in a group. Perhaps it was ritual, a prayer pressed into stone. Or perhaps it was something more profound, a proto-language of identity and presence, the beginning of the written word. Symbols, too, appeared alongside the animals and handprints. Clusters of dots, zigzags, chevrons, and spirals recur across caves separated by thousands of miles. Some researchers believe these symbols were a kind of code, an early system of notation. They may have tracked lunar cycles, migrations of herds, or seasons of abundance. If so, then these abstract marks were not merely decoration but structured thought, an early grammar of signs, a visual language. The connection between art and speech lies also in ritual. In many indigenous traditions today, song, dance, story, and painting are not separate but interwoven. To sing is to tell, to paint is to chant, to carve is to pray. If this is true of our living relatives, why not of our ancestors? The cave was likely not just a canvas but a stage, a place where voice, echo, image, and firelight merged into a single experience. The spoken word may have been inseparable from the painted line. Together, they formed a tapestry of communication richer than either alone. In these echoes of stone and art, we find the first evidence of humanity's desire to leave something behind. Language is always about presence and absence, the presence of meaning, the absence of the speaker. In painting, this paradox deepened. The artist could be absent, perhaps long dead, and yet the mark spoke still. These images remind us that communication is not only about survival or utility. It is about remembrance. It is about reaching beyond one's own time, to speak to those who have not yet been born. But there is also silence in these echoes. Unlike written words, we cannot decode the paintings with certainty. We can only guess at their meanings, infer from fragments, project from what we know of ourselves. This uncertainty mirrors the mystery of the first language. Both are lost, both leave traces, both invite us into the space between knowledge and imagination. The cave painting is not the first language, but it is its companion, a silent twin, a visual shadow of the spoken voice. To walk into a Paleolithic cave today is to enter a dialogue across tens of millennia. The damp walls hold not only pigment but memory. The painted animals seem alive in torchlight, as though ready to leap out. The handprints stretch toward us as if reaching across time. We stand in silence, our modern tongues unable to decipher their meanings, yet we feel spoken to nonetheless. It is a reminder that communication is not only about understanding, it is also about connection. The artists of prehistory may not have intended us as their audience, but we receive their message all the same. We were here, and we too spoke, in ways you may never fully grasp. Thus, in stone and art, we hear the faintest echoes of that first language. They do not give us the words, but they give us the yearning. They remind us that language is not only in the tongue, but in the gesture, the image, the mark. In every painted bison, in every spiraled symbol, in every hand pressed against rock, there is an echo of speech unspoken, the first language hiding in silence, remembered through stone. For tens of thousands of years, humanity spoke without writing. Our ancestors lived, loved, hunted, mourned, celebrated, and told stories, yet they left no direct record of their words. This vast span of human history, stretching back at least 100,000 years, is the silence before writing. It is the greatest library that has ever been lost, not because it burned or crumbled, but because it was never inscribed at all. Every tale, every myth, every argument or lullaby dissolved the moment breath ended. What remains to us is silence, punctuated only by artifacts, by bones, by art, and by questions. Writing, when it finally appeared some 5,000 years ago, was a revolutionary act. But before that, for nearly all of human existence, language was only sound, only vibration of air. Imagine the fragility of that system. A word existed only as long as someone remembered it. A story survived only if it was retold. An idea endured only if it passed from lips to ears, from memory to memory. And yet, fragile though it was, this oral web of language bound entire societies together. Anthropologists call such cultures oral traditions. Among many indigenous groups today, we glimpse echoes of this older world. Stories are not written down but carried in memory, passed through generations by ritual performance. A myth may last for millennia, but it does so not because it is fixed on stone, but because it is woven into the fabric of living communities. The silence before writing was not truly silence, it was full of voices, but those voices vanished the moment the people who carried them were gone. What makes this silence so haunting is that we know language existed, and likely in great diversity, but we cannot recover it. We know that Homo sapiens had fully developed speech at least 50,000 years ago. We know they sang, prayed, and debated. But unlike the paintings on cave walls, unlike the tools they left behind, speech left no fossil. The first languages lived only in the air. The first arguments echoed only in valleys now silent. The first names were whispered into ears that are now dust. Consider this. By the time writing was invented, language was already unimaginably ancient. If we compare the lifespan of language to the age of writing, writing appears as a mere flicker. Speech is the river, vast and ancient, while writing is only a tiny canal carved from its flow. To focus only on written history is to mistake the surface for the depths. Beneath our recorded words lie thousands of generations whose voices are gone, but whose languages shaped the world we inherited. This silence challenges historians. Without writing, how can we know what was said? How can we trace the myths, the philosophies, the first names for the stars? We are left with fragments. The rhythms of oral tradition echo faintly in later myths, like those of Mesopotamia or Greece, which were once oral before they were inscribed. By studying living oral cultures, scholars attempt to imagine the ancient world. Yet these are reconstructions, educated guesses. The actual words, the first stories, are irretrievable. And yet, perhaps silence is not emptiness. Perhaps it is its own kind of testimony. The silence before writing reminds us that language was never dependent on ink or clay. It was alive, immediate, intimate. To speak was to exist in the moment. To tell a story was to look another in the eyes and breathe meaning into their mind. Writing, for all its permanence, introduced distance. The silence before writing, though fragile, was filled with presence. Voices carried on the wind, carried in memory, bound people together in ways no tablet could replicate. But silence is also loss. Without writing, languages vanish entirely when a people disappears. Today, when a language dies without being written down, it leaves behind only silence. The pre-literate world was a graveyard of forgotten tongues. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of languages once spoken now leave no trace. They are unremembered not because they were unworthy, but because they were never recorded. It is a humbling thought. The first language, whatever it was, belongs to this silence. It existed, flourished, perhaps dominated, and then disappeared, leaving not a single word behind. Philosophically, this silence forces us to confront the fragility of memory. We live in an age of abundance, where every sound can be recorded, every thought typed and stored. But for most of human history, survival depended not on technology but on remembrance. Elders became libraries. Communities became archives. Ritual became the safeguard of continuity. The silence before writing was not silent at all, but it was precarious, always threatened by forgetting. And so, when writing finally arrived, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, it was less an invention than a revelation. It pierced the silence. It offered humanity the power to outlive its own voice. But it also created a divide between those whose languages were preserved in symbols, and those whose words remained only in breath. The vast majority of early human tongues belonged to the second group. They disappeared unheard, unremembered. In this sense, the silence before writing is not merely an absence. It is a presence too vast to capture, too fleeting to preserve. It is the unseen foundation of everything we know. Every written word, every book, every law and poem is only the tip of a mountain whose base lies in that immeasurable silence. To remember this is to honor what is lost, to acknowledge that language is greater than any record we can keep. The silence before writing is the silence of origins. It is where the first language lives, unseen and unheard, its echoes woven into us but never recoverable. To contemplate it is to stand before a vast night sky with no constellations drawn, knowing the stars are there but unnamed. It is to feel the weight of time and to sense, just beyond our grasp, the voices that once filled it. When writing emerged, it was not born as poetry. It was not created to capture love songs, myths, or the voices of children. Its earliest purpose was far more utilitarian, to chain memory, to bind the fleeting breath of language into something rigid, enduring, and accountable. The first scripts were not art, they were tools of control. They were marks pressed into clay to track debts, to count sheep, to ensure that one man could not deny what another had recorded. They were, in essence, chains on breath. Around 5,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia, small clay tokens had long been used to represent goods. A single cone-shaped token might signify a jar of oil, a sphere might stand for a sheep. For centuries, merchants and officials relied on these tokens to keep track of exchanges. But then came the breakthrough, pressing the tokens into clay tablets, creating impressions. Soon, the impressions themselves replaced the tokens. From this act, cuneiform was born, wedge-shaped marks carved into clay with a reed stylus. Breath had become clay. Language, once ephemeral, now left scars upon the earth. This was not an isolated miracle. In Egypt, nearly at the same time, hieroglyphs appeared. In the Indus Valley, complex signs adorned seals and pottery. In China, oracle bone inscriptions foretold destinies and recorded rituals. Humanity, in different places, almost simultaneously, discovered the power of trapping words in matter. Across cultures, writing emerged not first for literature, but for order, administration, ritual, and statecraft. To call these scripts chains is not to diminish their brilliance, but to acknowledge their dual nature. Writing liberated humans from the tyranny of memory. No longer did every story, every contract, every lineage need to be carried in fragile human minds. Yet, at the same time, writing restricted speech, fixing it, pinning it down like a butterfly in glass. Spoken language flowed, shifting with each telling. Written language demanded permanence. A scribe's tablet froze words in time, forbidding them to change. Imagine the awe of those first societies. For thousands of years, the only permanence belonged to stone and bone. Now, the human voice itself could be carved into permanence. But this permanence also introduced fear. Once words were written, they could not be forgotten, or denied. A debt recorded was a debt owed forever. A king's decree, once inscribed, became law beyond death. Writing made language an instrument of power. Philosophers later noted this paradox. The Greek philosopher Socrates, centuries after writing's invention, distrusted it. He warned that written words could not defend themselves. They could not answer questions or adapt like living speech. They were rigid, unchanging, unable to clarify. To him, writing was both a gift and a chain, fixing ideas but stripping them of vitality. In a way, Socrates was mourning what humanity lost when breath became clay. And yet, humans quickly saw the beauty hidden in these chains. Once scribes had mastered the art of recording debts and laws, they turned their styluses towards something higher. Myths, hymns, and epics were etched into tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh, born in Mesopotamia, is among the oldest surviving stories, but it was not the first story ever told. Countless myths had lived and died in the silence before writing. What makes Gilgamesh unique is not its originality, but its survival, its imprisonment in clay. To read those early texts today is to glimpse the moment language first realized it could outlive death. Gilgamesh seeks immortality, and in a sense, he finds it, not in life, but in writing. His story, once spoken, could have vanished like any other. Written, it endured for millennia. In this way, writing transformed not only memory, but mortality itself. Stories became ghosts that could haunt forever, trapped within symbols. But if writing preserved, it also excluded. In most ancient societies, literacy was rare. The chains of writing were wielded by the few, priests, kings, scribes. Ordinary people lived still in the world of orality, their voices unrecorded, their stories lost. Writing centralized power, creating hierarchies of knowledge. A farmer could forget a debt, but the clay tablet would remember. A priest could interpret the gods, but only those who knew the script could confirm or deny his claim. Thus, the invention of writing did not democratize language, it weaponized it. This tension remains with us today. Writing is liberation and confinement, memory and rigidity, permanence and loss. To write is to choose one form, one arrangement of words, forever closed to change. A spoken tale may vary with each telling, alive and adaptable. A written tale is crystallized. It gains endurance, but loses fluidity. Breath is chained, but also preserved. The earliest scribes likely did not see themselves as poets or philosophers. They were functionaries, record keepers, servants of order. And yet, in their scratches and marks lay the seeds of civilization's greatest art. From those chains on breath would emerge philosophy, law, literature, science, the entire edifice of recorded human thought. The act that began as accountancy became the foundation of culture. Even so, we must not forget what was sacrificed. For every Gilgamesh preserved, there were thousands of myths never written. For every king's decree, there were countless songs that vanished unrecorded. Writing preserved the powerful, but it silenced the powerless. It remembered what elites deemed important, but ignored the everyday poetry of the common people. The first scripts were not neutral, they were instruments of authority. The true human story, the laughter, the lullabies, the whispers, mostly remained chained only to memory, and thus, mostly lost. In reflecting on the first scripts, we stand between two worlds, the silence before writing, and the clamor of recorded history. We can trace the first chains of breath, but we also feel their weight. They bound words to permanence, but in doing so, they changed forever the way humans related to language, to time, and to themselves. Writing was not merely a tool. It was a transformation of consciousness. To this day, every book, every document, every inscription carries within it this dual legacy. It preserves and it restricts. It immortalizes and it ossifies. It is both freedom and prison. The first scripts remind us that language is never neutral. To write is to bind. To read is to unlock. To remember is to confront both the silence before writing and the chains that followed. If there is one constant truth about language, it is that it refuses to stay still. Like rivers, tongues branch, split, and erode. A single stream becomes a delta of channels, feeding new landscapes. No matter how hard societies attempt to preserve one pure form, language insists on change. It shifts in sound, in grammar, in rhythm, carried by the breath of countless generations. What begins as one language will inevitably become many. This is the Babel within us, not a tower built upward, but a tower of words breaking outward, fragmenting endlessly. The story of Babel, told in the Hebrew Bible, imagines a moment when humanity spoke one tongue. United, people sought to build a tower to the heavens. The divine response was confusion, their speech shattered into many languages, scattering them across the earth. While myth, the story captures a deep truth. Unity in speech is fragile, perhaps impossible. Even when one tongue dominates, time and distance pull it apart. Divergence is not a punishment but a natural law. Take Latin, once the language of Rome. For centuries, it spread across Europe, carried by soldiers, administrators, merchants. Yet as the empire crumbled, so too did Latin's uniformity. Isolated communities molded it into new forms: Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian. From one tongue, many were born, each with its own poetry and cadence. Latin itself lingered, fossilized in the church and academia, but it no longer lived on the streets. It had given birth to children that no longer recognized their parent. This cycle is not unique. Old English, spoken by the Anglo-Saxons, is unrecognizable to a modern English speaker. Over centuries, through invasions, borrowings, and gradual shifts, Old English became Middle English, and Middle English evolved into the global English we know today. If one were to place Beowulf beside Shakespeare, beside Toni Morrison, the differences would feel as vast as separate languages. And yet, they are connected, strands in a web stretching back through time. Languages diverge because people diverge. Geography separates communities. Mountains, rivers, and oceans create barriers. Social divisions deepen differences. Elites adopt one form, villagers another. Over generations, accents harden into dialects, and dialects into new tongues. What feels at first like minor variation, a vowel stretched here, a word replaced there, eventually becomes mutual incomprehension. At no single moment does one language die and another emerge. The shift is gradual, imperceptible to those living through it. But centuries later, the gulf is undeniable. And then, there is death. For if languages diverge endlessly, they also vanish endlessly. Most of the world's tongues have disappeared without record. Of the perhaps 7,000 spoken today, linguists predict that half may vanish within the next century. Each language lost is not merely a set of words, but a worldview extinguished. It is a way of describing the world, of remembering ancestors, of naming rivers and stars. To lose a language is to lose a library that exists nowhere else. Consider the case of Ayak, once spoken in Alaska. For centuries, it carried stories, ecological knowledge, and cultural wisdom. But as English spread, Ayak withered. In 2008, its last native speaker, Marie Smith Jones, passed away. With her, a language that had survived for generations fell silent. What remained were fragments in archives, dictionaries, recordings, notes. But the living breath was gone. The Babel within had one less voice. Such stories are not rare. They are the quiet tragedies of history, repeating across continents. In Australia, hundreds of Aboriginal languages once thrived. Most are now extinct or endangered. In the Americas, European colonization decimated indigenous tongues. In Africa, colonial borders and global languages overshadowed local speech. The engines of empire, commerce, and modernity often act as accelerators of language death. Where power consolidates, diversity diminishes. Yet, paradoxically, while languages vanish, new ones also emerge. Creoles and pidgins form where different peoples meet, blending vocabularies and grammars into new, vibrant hybrids. Haitian Creole, for example, arose from the collision of French, African languages, and the brutal conditions of colonial slavery. Far from being broken French, it became a fully formed, living language, carrying the resilience of its speakers. Even in loss, language creates anew. The Babel within us, then, is not only fragmentation but also regeneration. Just as old languages fade, new tongues sprout. The cycle is unending. It mirrors biological evolution, where species branch, adapt, and sometimes disappear. Linguists often speak of language families, mapping their relationships like genealogies. Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan, vast lineages spreading across continents. Each family tree reveals the deep interconnectedness of human voices, a web stretching back to roots we may never fully uncover. Still, the question haunts us: why do we not remember the first language? Why, despite our study of families and lineages, do we find only fragments and guesses about our linguistic origins? The answer lies partly in this relentless divergence. The further back we go, the more tangled the branches become, until the root disappears into mist. Time erodes sound, shifts, grammar, and meaning until connections dissolve. Memory, both cultural and linguistic, fades. And yet, there is something poetic in this forgetting. If we remembered the first tongue, perhaps language would feel like a closed circle. Instead, it feels like an open field, infinite in its possibilities. The Babel within is not a curse, but a gift. It ensures that language is never static, never finished. It allows each culture, each generation, to create anew. But with this gift comes responsibility. When a language dies, a piece of Babel's tower collapses forever. No amount of reconstruction can restore its full spirit. Preserving endangered tongues is not only a matter of heritage, but of imagination. Each one holds metaphors, rhythms, and stories that enlarge what it means to be human. Losing them shrinks the human soul. As we reflect on Babel, we realize that the scattering of tongues was not an ending but a beginning. It set humanity on a path of infinite variation, a chorus of voices rising and falling across millennia. Each language, no matter how small, is a note in that chorus. When one is silenced, the harmony diminishes. When one flourishes, the song grows richer. The Babel within is the essence of humanity's story, our unity and our division, our creativity and our forgetfulness, our loss and our rebirth. To search for the first language may be impossible, but to listen to the living languages around us is to hear echoes of that forgotten root. The voices diverge, but they carry within them faint traces of origins we cannot remember. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the mystery is what gives language its eternal power. If language is an invisible force, breathed into the air and gone in an instant, then how do we search for its beginnings? Unlike pottery, stone tools, or cave art, words do not fossilize. Sentences do not leave impressions in rock. There are no ancient scrolls from the deep Paleolithic, no recordings of the first voices. To find language in prehistory, scientists must chase shadows, echoes left not in words themselves, but in the bones that carried them, the tools shaped by thinking hands, and the art etched on cave walls. The first clue lies in the body itself. Speech is not possible without anatomy. The position of the larynx, the shape of the skull, the flexibility of the tongue, all these determine whether a creature can form a wide range of sounds. In early hominins like Australopithecus, the vocal tract was too limited for the full variety of human speech. But with Homo erectus and later Homo heidelbergensis, skeletal evidence hints at a transformation. Their hyoid bones, small, delicate structures at the base of the tongue, resemble our own. This suggests the capacity for a more complex range of vocalizations, perhaps the beginnings of true speech. The hyoid bone, though tiny, is a treasure. It is rarely preserved in fossils, yet when found, it offers direct anatomical evidence of speech potential. In 1989, archaeologists uncovered the hyoid of a Neanderthal in Israel's Kabra cave. To many researchers, it looked nearly identical to that of modern humans. The implication was profound. Neanderthals may not have grunted in crude tones, as once caricatured, but spoken with nuance, perhaps with languages as rich as our own. Still, bones alone cannot prove speech. To imagine language, we must also consider the brain. While brains themselves do not fossilize, the impressions they leave on the inner surfaces of skulls, called endocasts, reveal their size and sometimes their organization. Enlarged areas corresponding to Broca's area and Wernicke's area, regions linked with speech and comprehension, appear in early Homo species. These shifts suggest that the architecture for language was developing long before written history. Yet anatomy tells only part of the story. Language is not just the ability to make sounds, it is the ability to encode meaning, to share abstract thought. To glimpse this, archaeologists look to culture. Around 100,000 years ago, symbolic behavior bloomed in the archaeological record. Beads made from shells, pigments used for body painting, geometric carvings etched into stone, these are not merely practical objects. They carry meaning. They are signs of minds capable of abstraction, of shared symbols. And shared symbols are the bedrock of language. Consider Blombo's cave in South Africa. Here, archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre carved with cross-hatched designs, dating to around 75,000 years ago. These marks serve no utilitarian purpose. They are expressions, patterns intended to signify something beyond survival. They may have been early symbols, perhaps even part of a proto-language, visual echoes of spoken thought. If people were capable of such abstraction, it is difficult to imagine they were not also speaking in complex tongues. Cave art extends this argument. In Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, images of animals gallop across walls, painted with skill and intention more than 30,000 years ago. These are not mere decorations but windows into communication. To create such art required not only technical skill but also a community that shared stories, myths, and meanings. Language, whether spoken or gestured, would have been the invisible scaffolding beneath these creations. Even tools themselves whisper of language. Stone hand axes, crafted with symmetry and foresight, suggest teaching. Their complexity implies that knowledge was passed down not through imitation alone but through instruction, likely aided by speech. Later, in the Upper Paleolithic, the proliferation of blades, needles, and bone instruments reflects not only innovation but the cultural transmission that language enables. Without words, such continuity across generations would have been nearly impossible. And yet, the echoes remain faint. We cannot hear the voices of Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens. We can only piece together evidence from stone, bone, and pigment. It is a puzzle missing its most vital piece, sound itself. Some scientists attempt reconstructions, modeling what proto-languages might have sounded like. These efforts use comparative linguistics, tracing modern languages backward through time, hypothesizing the phonemes of long-lost tongues. But the deeper we go, the more uncertain the reconstruction becomes. Beyond 10,000 years, the trail fades. Beyond 50,000, it vanishes almost entirely. The frustration is palpable. Here is humanity's most defining trait, and yet it leaves so few fossils. But perhaps this absence itself is telling. Language was never meant to be permanent. Its power lies in its ephemerality, in the way it lives only when spoken and shared. What we find in archaeology are not the words themselves, but their footprints, signs of minds that spoke, that dreamed, that imagined. Some researchers propose that music may be our earliest preserved form of proto-language. Flutes carved from bird bones, dating back 40,000 years, suggest that melody and rhythm accompanied early human life. Music, like language, organizes sound into structure. It communicates emotion, creates cohesion, and moves hearts. Perhaps before words were fixed, song carried our first shared meanings. In this view, speech evolved not from silence but from singing, a chorus before a sentence. Archaeology of speech is thus an act of listening to silence. We kneel before bones and tools, straining to hear what they cannot say. We peer into cave paintings, searching for whispers. We study the delicate shape of the hyoid, imagining voices that may never be heard again. Every discovery is both revelation and reminder of how much is lost. And yet, what emerges from these fragments is a profound truth. Language is older than memory, older than writing, older than any living culture. It has been with us for tens of thousands of years, shaping every tool, every ritual, every story. To trace its echoes in stone and bone is to glimpse the invisible thread that binds all of humanity. We may never recover the first word ever spoken, but in the silence of caves, in the curve of a fossilized hyoid, in the etched patterns of ochre, we sense that moment's ghost. Archaeology does not give us the words themselves, but it assures us they were there. And in that assurance lies wonder. Humanity has always been speaking, always reaching, always weaving meaning into the air. Every family of languages we know today, Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan, Niger-Congo, and hundreds more, is like a branch sprouting from an older trunk. Linguists have long sought to follow these branches back to the root. If all humans share a common origin, might all languages descend from one ancestral tongue, a mother language, spoken tens of thousands of years ago? The pursuit of this proto-language has captured both scholarly imagination and poetic longing, for it promises to reveal not only the words our ancestors spoke, but the essence of what it means to be human. The idea is tantalizingly simple. Just as DNA traces all humans back to shared ancestors, language too might trace back to a single point of origin. If Homo sapiens emerged from Africa around 200,000 years ago, perhaps their speech arose from one source, carried across continents as people spread. But languages, unlike genes, do not leave fossils. They mutate quickly, shedding words and sounds like leaves in the wind. Within 8,000 to 10,000 years, a language changes so thoroughly that it becomes almost unrecognizable from its ancestors. Beyond that horizon, the linguistic trail dissolves into mist. Still, the dream persists. In the 19th century, as linguists were uncovering the vast Indo-European family, linking Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and English to a common ancestor, some dared to wonder if this process could go deeper. Could we move beyond families, beyond superfamilies, all the way back to a single origin? The possibility was exhilarating, but the evidence was elusive. In the late 20th century, researchers like Joseph Greenberg attempted bold classifications, grouping world languages into a few macrofamilies. He suggested, for instance, that nearly all African languages could be traced to just 4 ancestral groups, and even hinted at a global unity. His methods, relying on mass lexical comparison rather than detailed reconstruction, were controversial, criticized as too sweeping and impressionistic. Yet they kept alive the vision of a shared linguistic root. Others took the quest further. Linguist Merritt Rulin and geneticist Luigi Cavalli Sforza argued that a proto-world language once existed, perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. They claimed that certain basic words, for water, for family, for body parts, might have survived across millennia, embedded in all languages. These ultra-conserved words, they suggested, could be the faint fossils of our original tongue. One example is the word for mother. Across cultures, the syllables ma, mama, or ama appear again and again. From English mother to Hindi ma, from Mandarin ma to Swahili mama, the pattern persists. Could this be coincidence? Or is it an echo of the first sounds ever spoken between parent and child? Some linguists argue that these words emerge naturally because of how infants babble, ma being one of the easiest syllables to produce. Yet the poetry of imagining it as a relic of the world's first language is hard to resist. But the further back we reach, the more fragile the evidence becomes. Language changes not only in words but in sounds, structures, and grammar. English today is almost incomprehensible compared to its Old English form only 1,000 years ago. If so much transformation happens in a millennium, what chance do we have of reconstructing speech from 50 millennia past? Skeptics argue that the search for a single proto-language is futile. They suggest that language may have arisen in multiple places at once, in parallel, as different groups of Homo sapiens experimented with symbolic communication. Perhaps instead of one mother tongue, there were many sister tongues, born in scattered communities, each giving rise to the linguistic diversity we see today. In this view, the dream of a single origin is an illusion, a story we tell because we long for unity. And yet, genetics provides intriguing hints that the dream might not be entirely fanciful. Studies of mitochondrial DNA trace all living humans to a common African ancestor roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, a woman sometimes poetically called mitochondrial Eve. If all humans descend from her lineage, might all languages descend from a shared cultural context of her time? Perhaps not a single fixed language, but a pool of dialects and words exchanged among early Homo sapiens. A river of speech with many currents, but one source. Even if the mother tongue cannot be recovered, linguists attempt approximations through reconstructed proto-languages closer to us in time. Proto-Indo-European, spoken around 6,000 years ago, has been partly reconstructed through comparative linguistics. Words like were, water, and metuter, mother, are linguistic ghosts, carefully reassembled from their descendants. Going deeper, some attempt to reconstruct Proto-Nostratic, a hypothesized ancestor of Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, and other families. Each step is more speculative, more contested, but also more daring, each one a leap toward that unreachable origin. The quest is not only scientific but philosophical. To imagine a first language is to imagine the dawn of meaning itself. What were those first words? Were they cries of warning, like snake or fire? Were they names, the first labels for objects and people? Or were they intimate sounds, mother, child, friend, born from love rather than fear? Every hypothesis is colored by how we imagine the earliest humans, as hunters shouting across the plains, or as families huddled around fires, whispering comfort in the night. Perhaps the truth lies in both. Language likely began as a blend of necessity and intimacy, the urgent need to survive, and the equally urgent need to belong. The dream of a mother tongue is not just about reconstructing words. It is about reconstructing the first bonds of humanity, the shared fabric of sound that made us who we are. Whether or not a proto-world language ever existed may never be resolved. The evidence grows fainter the further back we reach, until it dissolves entirely. But in the very act of searching, we glimpse something profound. We glimpse the unity of humankind, the possibility that beneath our thousands of languages, our dialects and scripts, there is a common spark. A spark that flared in the deep past and has never gone out. The dream of a mother tongue is, ultimately, a mirror. It reflects our longing for origins, our hunger to trace the threads of memory back to their source. Even if the first language is forever beyond our grasp, the dream itself tells us something essential. We are a species that seeks connection, that listens for echoes across time. We may never know the first word, but we know why it was spoken, to reach another human heart. And that, perhaps, is answer enough. Long before linguists drew trees of descent, before archaeology uncovered traces of vanished peoples, ancient storytellers wrestled with the question of why humans speak in so many tongues. For them, the diversity of languages was not a technical puzzle but a cosmic drama, a mystery demanding explanation. Myths emerged across cultures, offering poetic answers to a riddle that still haunts us today. If humanity is one, why are our voices divided? The most famous of these is the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. In Genesis, humanity once spoke with a single tongue. Confident and unified, they set out to build a tower that would reach the heavens. But God, disapproving of their pride, confused their speech. Suddenly unable to understand one another, they abandoned the project and scattered across the earth. The origin of languages, in this tale, was not natural drift but divine intervention, a deliberate fragmentation to humble human ambition. This story has endured not because of its literal plausibility but because of its symbolic power. The Tower of Babel dramatizes both the beauty and the tragedy of linguistic diversity. It suggests that once, unity was possible, and that our current condition of fragmentation is both a punishment and a reminder. To speak a different language is, in this myth, to inhabit a different destiny. But Babel is not alone. Many cultures preserve myths explaining the origin of languages. Among the Mayans, the Popol Vuh tells of gods who gave humans words but later fractured their speech so that cooperation would be difficult. In some Native American traditions, languages were divided during a great migration or after a quarrel among tribes. In Africa, stories tell of a first, shared tongue shattered by conflict or divine will. Again and again, the motif appears. Once there was unity, and now there is difference. These myths reflect a deep human intuition, that multiplicity must have begun with oneness. Just as rivers split from a source, so two languages must once have flowed from a single spring. Even when cultures never encountered one another, they reached for the same explanation. We once spoke together, and something broke us apart. From a modern perspective, these stories can be read as metaphors for forgetting. Language change is a slow erosion, not a sudden divine act. Yet to those living through it, the shift can feel abrupt and bewildering. Imagine a generation of grandchildren who no longer understand their grandparents' words, or neighboring tribes whose dialects drift into incomprehension. For them, it would feel as though some higher power had severed their bonds. The myth of Babel gives voice to that sense of loss. There is also a moral dimension. In Babel, linguistic diversity is portrayed not as a gift but as a curse, a punishment for arrogance. This framing reflects a tension that persists even today. Is the proliferation of languages a barrier to unity or a wellspring of creativity? On one hand, difference hinders communication. On the other, it enriches the human experience, offering countless ways to see and describe the world. Myths tilt toward caution, warning us that pride and division are intertwined. Yet we must not overlook the psychological function of these stories. Myths of linguistic origin comfort us with the idea of a beginning, a point of clarity from which all else flowed. They acknowledge our longing for an origin story that restores a sense of coherence to the bewildering diversity around us. Just as creation myths explain the birth of the world, language myths explain the birth of meaning. The Tower of Babel resonates especially because it touches on themes of memory and forgetting. If once we shared a tongue, then the multiplicity of languages represents a collective amnesia. Humanity has forgotten its first words, scattered them to the winds. And the myth suggests that this forgetting was inevitable, even necessary. To grow, humans had to disperse, to differentiate, to build cultures with their own identities. Diversity, in this sense, is both loss and gain, the price of becoming many instead of remaining one. From a philosophical perspective, Babel also raises questions about human ambition. Was the desire to reach heaven through a tower wrong, or was it simply the natural striving of a species that dreams of more? If language is what made that dream possible, then the fragmentation of tongues is not just a punishment but a safeguard, preventing us from overreaching. Myths often encode warnings about balance, about the dangers of excess. In this light, Babel is less about divine cruelty than about a reminder of limits. But myths endure not because they resolve questions, but because they keep them alive. The Tower of Babel, like other stories of linguistic division, still shapes how we think about language today. We speak of Babel to describe confusion, cacophony, a multiplicity of voices. We imagine translation as a way to rebuild the tower, to undo the curse. Even projects like the dream of a universal language, from Esperanto to machine translation, echo the myth's yearning for reunion. The truth, of course, is that no single event shattered language into fragments. The diversification of tongues was gradual, natural, and inevitable. But myths tell a deeper truth. They reveal how it felt to live in a world where understanding slips away, where neighbors become strangers through sound alone. They remind us that language is not only a tool but a bond, and that when bonds break, stories step in to explain the fracture. In the end, the myth of Babel is not about architecture or divine punishment. It is about memory and identity. It gives narrative shape to the fact that no one remembers the first language. It tells us that forgetting is part of being human, and that diversity is both the wound and the gift that forgetting leaves behind. And perhaps that is why the story still resonates. In every language spoken today, there is a whisper of Babel, the reminder that our voices are many, but our longing is one. Language is not just a means of communication. It is a vessel of memory, a container of thought, a living archive of what a people know, believe, and dream. To speak a word is to inherit not just a sound, but the long chain of ancestors who shaped that sound, who gave it meaning, who passed it along through stories, rituals, and everyday exchanges. When we open our mouths to speak, we carry within us centuries of memory, woven invisibly into grammar, rhythm, and tone. And yet, just as memory fades in the mind of an individual, so too do languages slip away in the memory of humanity. Thousands of tongues have already gone silent. Thousands more teeter on the brink of disappearance, with only a handful of speakers remaining. Each time a language vanishes, it is not only words that are lost. It is a way of remembering the world. Consider this. In some Aboriginal Australian languages, there are dozens of words for specific types of movement across a landscape, words that encode direction, environment, and the position of stars. To lose such a language is to lose an entire navigational memory, a way of orienting oneself in both geography and cosmos. In other cultures, words for kinship trace the structure of family ties, mapping obligations and relationships in ways that no translation can fully capture. When those words fall silent, so too does the memory of how those communities understood themselves. Language is memory embodied, but unlike written archives, it lives in fragile form, in the breath of living people. It depends on speakers, on parents teaching children, on communities passing stories around fires. When that chain breaks, memory withers. Unlike books stored in libraries, unwritten languages leave almost no trace once they vanish. They slip away like unrecorded dreams, remembered for a moment, then gone forever. The loss is not only cultural but emotional. For communities that watch their language decline, the experience is like mourning. Elders feel grief when grandchildren cannot understand their stories. Rituals lose meaning when their words must be replaced with foreign ones. Songs become hollow when sung in a tongue that does not carry the weight of generations. To lose a language is to lose a part of oneself, to lose the intimate mirror that reflects identity back to the community. And yet, the persistence of language also reveals the resilience of memory. Even under centuries of colonization, forced assimilation, and cultural suppression, some languages endure. They survive in whispered lullabies, in coded conversations, in secret gatherings where words are preserved like sacred fire. The very act of speaking an endangered tongue becomes an act of resistance, a refusal to let memory die. Memory in language is layered. Some of it is practical, knowledge of plants, animals, medicine, and survival. Some of it is symbolic, myths, cosmologies, and rituals that give meaning to existence. And some of it is emotional, the sound of a mother's voice, the jokes of friends, the familiar rhythm of prayer. Language stores memory not just as data, but as experience, the flavor of life itself. We might think of language as a collective diary written in sound. Unlike paper diaries, this one is endlessly revised. New words enter, old ones fade. Grammar shifts. Meanings evolve. Yet beneath the change, the diary retains its entries, faint traces of earlier times still detectable in roots, idioms, and forgotten phrases. Just as archaeologists dig for fossils, linguists dig through words to find the bones of memory, ancient forms buried beneath modern speech. And yet, even when memory is carried forward, it is never complete. Every generation forgets something. Words vanish, meanings shift, songs go unsung. In this way, languages mirror the human mind, remembering some things vividly, letting others dissolve into silence. To speak any language is to inherit not only what has been preserved, but also what has been lost. Our tongues carry gaps, absences, silent spaces where memories once lived. This raises a profound question: is memory ever whole? Or is it always partial, fragmented, incomplete? If no one remembers the first language, perhaps it is because no language could ever carry the totality of human experience. Each one is a shard, a fragment, a perspective. Together, they form a mosaic, dazzling in diversity, but always unfinished. And yet, the loss accelerates in our time. Experts estimate that by the end of this century, half of the world's languages may be extinct. The memory carried in them will vanish too. What we lose is not only communication but imagination. Each language offers a unique lens for perceiving the world. To lose one is to dim the spectrum of human possibility, to narrow the range of what we can remember, imagine, and express. But there is also hope. Around the globe, communities are reviving their ancestral tongues. Through schools, recordings, and digital tools, they are planting memory back into the soil of daily life. Children once again learn words thought lost. Songs are sung anew. The revival of language is the revival of memory, proof that even when forgotten, some things can be remembered again. This struggle to preserve or revive language is, in essence, a struggle against forgetting. It is a recognition that what we carry in our words defines who we are. To lose a language is to lose a memory of being human in a particular way. To preserve it is to honor the past and expand the future. Ultimately, language teaches us that memory is not passive. It is active, living, demanding. It must be spoken, sung, and shared to endure. Just as silence can erase, speech can preserve. The memory we carry is only as strong as our willingness to keep breathing life into words. And so, when we reflect on why no one remembers the first language, perhaps the answer lies here. Memory is fragile, carried on the lips of the living. To forget is human. To remember requires effort, devotion, and care. Languages are living memory, and in them, we glimpse both the beauty of what we carry, and the sorrow of what we lose. At the heart of human history lies a silence. Somewhere in the long twilight of prehistory, the first word was spoken, a sound not of instinct but of intention, a sound that carried meaning beyond the moment. It may have been a cry, a name, a warning, or a song. Whatever it was, it marked the threshold between animal and human, between noise and language. And yet, despite its unimaginable importance, no one remembers it. No record exists. No echo remains. The first word is lost to us, swallowed by time. This silence is not merely an absence of evidence, it is the nature of language itself. Words live only when spoken. They vanish into the air, ephemeral, carried on breath. Writing came much later, tens of thousands of years after speech, and even then it could only capture a small fragment of human expression. The first word existed long before anyone thought to carve symbols into clay or ink letters onto parchment. It belonged to a world where memory was carried in bodies and voices, not in books. That world has dissolved, leaving behind only traces, tools, bones, art, but never the sound of speech. And so, the first word remains unknowable. We can imagine it, reconstruct it, speculate about it, but we cannot recover it. It is like the first dream ever dreamed, or the first song ever sung, a beginning that leaves no footprint. This mystery unsettles us because language defines who we are. To know the first word would be to know the origin of ourselves. Its absence feels like a missing piece of identity, a silence at the core of our story. Yet perhaps this silence holds a deeper truth. Language, by its nature, resists permanence. Unlike stone or bone, it is fluid. It shifts, adapts, evolves. It is not meant to be fixed in place. The first word is forgotten because forgetting is part of what makes language alive. Just as individuals cannot remember their first breath, humanity cannot remember its first utterance. Origins dissolve so that life may continue. The silence of the first word also reminds us that language is communal. No word can exist in isolation. A sound becomes a word only when another hears it, understands it, and responds. The first word was not the achievement of a single person but of a group, a shared recognition that sound could hold meaning. To search for the first word may be misguided, because language was never a solitary invention. It was a collective awakening. And collective awakenings do not leave behind singular monuments, they leave behind shared transformations too vast to be contained in a single sound. Still, we long to imagine. Was the first word a name, a way to call someone across the firelight? Was it a cry of danger, pointing to a predator in the dark? Was it a plea, a demand, or a promise? Or was it something softer, a lullaby hummed to a child, a sound of comfort transformed into a symbol of love? Every possibility reveals a different origin story for humanity. Each suggests what mattered most when we first crossed the threshold into language. What we do know is that whatever the first word was, it did not stay alone for long. Language is not built from single bricks but from growing structures. One word becomes two become a pattern, a rhythm, a system. Soon there are sentences, stories, myths. The first word is forgotten precisely because it was overtaken by all the words that followed, like a spark lost in the blaze of a fire it ignited. In this way, the silence of origins is not emptiness but fullness. The first word vanishes into the vast chorus of all the words spoken since. Every language on earth, every poem, every whispered secret, every declaration of love or grief, all of it is the echo of that forgotten beginning. To search for the first word is to stand at the edge of a forest and try to hear the sound of the first tree that grew. You cannot isolate it, but you can marvel at the living expanse it made possible. There is also humility in this forgetting. In a world where we often strive to preserve, record, and archive everything, the first word reminds us that some things will always lie beyond our reach. No matter how advanced our science becomes, some mysteries will remain. And perhaps that is as it should be. If the first word had been preserved, reduced to a sound file we could replay endlessly, it might lose its power. Its mystery is what keeps it alive in our imagination. The silence is not a failure of memory but a gift of wonder. For every person alive today, the first word is unknowable, but the first word we each speak as children is not. In those fragile syllables, mama, papa, or any other sound, we repeat the ancient miracle of language's birth. Each generation reenacts the origin of speech, not as history but as living experience. The first word may be forgotten, but the first word of every child keeps its spirit alive. Humanity's beginning is replayed every day, across every culture, across every language. The silence of origins is not a dead end, but a circle returning always to life. And so, the question, why no one remembers the first language, leads us to a deeper realization. Perhaps the first language is not meant to be remembered. It is meant to be lived. It exists not in the past but in the present, renewed every time we speak, every time we share a story, every time we find meaning in sound. The first word is forgotten, but its legacy is unbroken. We are, all of us, descendants of silence. From that silence emerged a sound, and from that sound, a world. Though the first word is lost, its absence does not leave us empty. It leaves us in awe. It leaves us humbled before the mystery of beginnings. And it leaves us grateful for the countless words that followed, words that allow us to remember, to imagine, and to wonder. In the end, the silence of the first word is not a failure of memory but a reminder of our humanity. We are creatures of forgetting as much as remembering. And in that forgetting, we find space for imagination, for mystery, for reverence. The first word may be gone, but the story it began is still unfolding, in every voice, in every language, in every word we speak today. There comes a moment, at the end of every great journey, when one turns back to reflect. We have traveled across millennia, traced the rise of languages, explored the disappearance of tongues, and followed the shadows of words lost to silence. Yet here, at the end, the question still lingers. Why does no one remember the first language? The answer is simple. and at the same time profound. It is because language was never meant to be remembered in one fixed form. It was meant to live, to grow, to transform, and to scatter like seeds on the wind. What is alive must change. What changes must eventually leave its old shape behind. The first language is forgotten not because it was weak, but because it was alive. Every breath we take when we speak carries a trace of it. We may not recognize the syllables, the structures, or the sounds, but its essence flows through every word uttered today. From the lullaby sung to a newborn, to the speeches that echo through parliaments, to the whispered prayers carried into the night, all are branches of an unseen root. That root is the first language. The silence of its absence is not emptiness. It is the fertile ground from which everything else has grown. In this realization lies a reversal. Forgetting becomes a form of remembrance. We may not know the first word, yet we feel its presence in the miracle of speech itself. To speak at all, in any language, is to honor the forgotten origin. The words we use today, no matter how modern, carry within them the weight of countless ancestors whose tongues shaped them. The past is not gone. It is alive in every syllable that passes between us. The first language was never meant to be preserved like a fossil in stone. Fossils are static, unchanging, lifeless. Language was meant to flow, to break apart and reform, to find new shapes as humans wandered, built, dreamed, and changed. If it had remained, fixed and immovable, perhaps it would have been too brittle to endure the storms of time. By vanishing, it survived, not in memory, but in transformation. And so, the forgetting is a gift. In the absence of the first word, humanity was given the freedom to create countless others. Out of silence came poetry. Out of loss came diversity. Out of disappearance came abundance. The forgetting allowed language to become a living, breathing force, endlessly adaptable, endlessly renewed. To try and recover the first language would be to freeze it once more, to deny it the vitality that forgetting bestowed upon it. But how do we honor something we cannot remember? The answer lies not in trying to reconstruct the past, but in listening more carefully to the present. When we pause to hear the voices around us, in marketplaces, in songs, in quiet conversations, we are hearing echoes of the ancient tongue. Not literal echoes, but spiritual ones, the resonances of a primal need to connect, to share meaning, to bridge the silence between souls. Every word is both new and ancient at the same time. A child, learning to speak, demonstrates this mystery. The child is not remembering a first language. They are reliving the first miracle of it. Their babbling, their instinctive grasp of sounds, their joy at discovering meaning, these are the same sparks that lit the earliest fires of human speech. The first word may be gone, but the first experience of language is reborn in every child who learns to speak. This is how the forgotten endures, not in memory, but in repetition, in cycles of rebirth carried across generations. Language is not only survival. It is beauty. It is the way we sing, the way we write, the way we confess love and articulate grief. It builds civilizations, but it also builds intimacy between two hearts. The first language is forgotten, yes, but its spirit is here, present in the act of speaking itself. When you tell someone you love them, when you share a story, when you comfort someone in sorrow, you are speaking with the same impulse that shaped that original word. You are keeping the spirit alive. So the story closes not with absence, but with presence. The first language is not lost in a grave of history. It is here, alive in us, transformed beyond recognition but still pulsing with the same essence. We need not mourn it. We need only recognize that it has become everything. The forgotten has become the universal. The silence has become the eternal echo. And perhaps this is the final secret, that the first language was never meant to be remembered as one thing. Its destiny was to vanish so that it could become many. Its destiny was to dissolve into the infinite shapes of human expression. To remember it as a single tongue would diminish what it gave us. To forget it is to allow it to live forever, in every dialect, every song, every cry of joy or despair. This is why no one remembers the first language. And this is why, in truth, it was never forgotten at all. For in this very moment, across every continent, in every voice, in every story told and every silence shared, it still speaks. The first language is not behind us, locked away in time. It is around us, within us, echoing endlessly through the miracle of speech. The first word has vanished, but the miracle of words lives on, forever.